Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Congress isn't sidelined because it has to be. It's sidelined because lawmakers are choosing to sit out the tough decisions. In today's hyper-partisan, president-driven politics, passivity has become a survival strategy. But when Congress steps back, the balance of power shifts, leaving fewer checks on the executive branch and fewer ways for the public to hold government accountable. That's the warning from Philip Wallach, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who joins me now. Mr. Wallach, thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be with you.
Let's start with the title of your paper, Choosing Irrelevance. What do you mean by that when you apply that title to Congress?
I think Congress has been getting marginalized over many decades now. In our constitutional system. I think that's unfortunate because our Constitution really contemplates it as sort of the beating heart of self-government. And I think, unfortunately, in 2025, we've seen Congress sort of steering into that choice of irrelevance and subsidiarity and sort of just wanting to serve the presidency more than anything else. So
you're seeing its current state sort of as on trend? Not as something that's a new condition?
It's definitely a long-term trend, but I do see what's happening this year to be especially concerning.
And so tell me more about what is happening and why it's so concerning.
Well, we live in a very partisan era, hyper-partisan people call it, where legislators act as good team members before anything else, before even as faithful representatives of their particular constituents. And that's not a new thing. That's not something that Donald Trump brought with him even. But it is something that shapes how the Congress organizes itself today and how members see themselves and see their own roles. So I think that's longstanding, but it's sort of jumped up into some new phase now where really a loyalty test is sort of the first thing before anything else. And sort of actively performing one's loyalty is maybe the most important thing that one is doing as a member of Congress. At least that's how a lot of them seem to see their jobs these days. So I think that's a really dangerous trend. I think it makes it hard for people to be effective policymakers, makes it hard for people to represent their constituents effectively. I don't think that's the only thing that people are even today, but I'm worried about that.
The condition that you describe right now is particular with Republicans and a Republican president. But in your paper, you describe this sort of pattern across both parties over time. What are the political incentives that make this sort of passive go-along strategy a winner for lawmakers today?
I think the presidency just looms so large in the minds of most American citizens today, and even in most legislators' minds, that legislators of both parties are content making themselves into sort of handmaidens of the presidency. So I think that criticism applies full force to Democrats during the Biden administration. I think very many times they went out of their way to use their positions of prominence as a way to lobby the executive branch to do something. They've come to think that working through their own legislature is too inconvenient and clunky, and executive action is the way things actually happen in Washington today. So they make themselves into advocates or activists or lobbyists. And they're not those things. They're legislators, they're constitutional officers in their own right who ought to see the possibilities of legislative action as being something quite independent from the presidency.
There have been some reform caucuses in Congress trying to make changes to congressional structure, committee structure that might reinvigorate some of that legislative activity. Why haven't they gotten more traction?
It's a great question. I think members look at the next election. They buy their leader's pitch that the next election is of utmost importance, and we need to stick together as a team to do as well as we can in the next election. That means trying to frame the agenda on terms favorable to us. And that takes first priority for most of them. They're happy to play that role because they really do believe in the importance. Now, the question is, when can you ever get out of that mindset? When can you ever say, well, the next election is always going to seem important, but we actually need to step back and do some institutional work where we think about our body's place in the overall system, whether or not it's convenient for the next election. It's hard to find that moment.
I'm speaking with Philip Wallach. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the author of the book, Why Congress? In your essay, you do say that there are some places of congressional strength or functionality that we might be overlooking. Tell us more about those.
Well, I think it's important, first of all, to look at the big, beautiful bill. This is Trump's signature legislative accomplishment, but I think it's important to understand it was really shaped by members of Congress, Republican members of Congress exclusively, right? This was a purely partisan lawmaking process, drawn up that way from the start and executed successfully. So, there was a lot of interesting factional interplay within the Republican Party in shaping that bill. A lot of different members got their chance to shape different parts of it. I think the most famous example of somebody who helped push the bill over the line and extracted a big concessions in return would be Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Got a lot of special treatment for her state, where she felt she was really doing something important for the people of Alaska. So those kinds of dynamics are still at work, but it matters that it's all in contribution to this one giant bill that is ultimately collated and edited by the partisan leaders in each chamber and certainly scrutinized by the White House as well. So that kind of process is not conducive to a lot of decentralized creativity. It really makes everything flow through the central leadership in ways that I find a little troubling. Now, the other thing we should talk about is the power of the purse. Congress has exercised its responsibility to choose how we spend our tax dollars on an annual basis. Now, we have lots of troubles with that, as I'm sure your listeners know. We have shutdown scares and actual shutdowns. We have debt ceiling standoffs that spook everybody every couple of years. So it's not like this has been a wonderfully smooth process, but we have, in fact, been passing appropriations laws every year with big bipartisan majorities. That's the only way we know how to do it, and we've done it. That's a big deal in terms of saying, as messed up as our political system may be, we find a way to come together and figure out how to spend our money on terms we can all agree to, or enough of us can agree to.
But that may be at risk this year.
That's right. And so in fiscal year 2025, we failed at that. All we managed to do was pass a full-year continuing resolution, which brought forward all the spending levels of fiscal year 2024. That's a punt, right? That's Congress deciding that it can't decide and making the best with what's already there. I think there's some indication that the White House would like to just see another continuing resolution for fiscal year 2026. That would represent Congress sort of losing its grip on the purse, right? It's sort of saying, actually, we can't manage the political accommodation necessary to let us be a functional legislature in charting out a spending course. We're just going to say, keep on stumbling forward. And that would open the door then for more and more executive branch adjustments, whether they came through formal rescissions packages like the one we saw a couple months ago, or whether they came through more unilateral executive action.
You also make the point that Congress has, over time, ceded its authority in foreign affairs to the executive.
Yeah, I think that's been a deliberate, a century-long process where Congress thought there were good reasons for empowering the presidency and for building up this national security state around the presidency. They realized that there are certain institutional advantages to having things where there's one decider who can act quickly and nimbly in negotiations with other countries. So they've had their good reasons, but as we've seen with tariffs now, they may have built up so much power in the executive branch that it can now be used rather capriciously in ways that Congress would never have intended, as it did endow the presidency with these powers for what it thought were good reasons, we may have now reached a moment where we have to take stock and say, wow, we seem to have given the presidency so much power that it's out of control.
Given where we are, if Congress wanted to reclaim its relevance, and I say if because it's not clear to me, what would that look like? Would there be specific reforms? Would there be cultural shifts that would have to happen in order for lawmakers to kind of reclaim their constitutional role?
My mantra is where there's a will, there's a way. I think it's not obvious what the formal steps would be. I tend to focus on re-empowering committees because I do think that was one of the ways that Congress built up its influence by having powerful committees and members who were committed to working on those committees for many years and gained real respect and influence by building up expertise in their respective jurisdictions. But I think the more important point is that members just have to decide that this is what they want, and they're willing to spend some of their political capital on this, even though it's often politically inconvenient.
I've been speaking with Philip Wallach. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the author of the book, Why Congress? We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former senior advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization, really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down, and work hard, etc. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, etc. Even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity, DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences, and that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one coming from the insurance industry. That's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography Loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has pearls of wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.